The impacts, I think, will be a bit of a mixed bag. Obviously, the incentive has played an important role in encouraging EV purchases for some share of the population.
Welcome back to Car Pinionated, our weekly show on cars, the car industry, and driving in general. This week we have a special guest from Automotive News, Molly Boygon, who is going to talk to us about EV tax credits, which are coming to an end on the federal level at the end of the month. So, Molly, what should consumers know about the situation with EV tax credits right now?
Consumers should know that through the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed in 2022, there is a tax credit available that's up to $4,000 for used electric vehicles and up to $7,500 for new electric vehicles that through an act of Congress is expiring on September 30th. So if folks are interested in purchasing an EV and taking advantage of that benefit, they have until September 30th to sign the contract and make it happen.
And that's been something that's come up in the this past week, where it had been that they had to take delivery, but now they just have to sign all the paperwork.
That's right. There was guidance from the IRS released recently that clarified this point of confusion. The auto industry had originally relied on the assumption that eligible vehicles needed to be delivered before September 30th in order for consumers to take advantage of the tax credit. It's now clear that they just have to sign the contract and basically square away payment, and the vehicle can be delivered after September 30th and still be eligible for the tax credit.
Because oftentimes that's a messy process.
That's
It's paperwork, it's insurance cards, and all this other stuff. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, it gives the consumer, the dealer, the automaker a bit more time to kind of square away some of those logistics.
And what are dealers experiencing right now? What's your understanding of how dealers are dealing with this?
The tax credit has been a source of some confusion since the beginning. The auto industry expected that the Trump administration would eliminate the tax credit at some point. The September 30th deadline is a little bit earlier than expected. So, for example, an earlier House version of the budget bill, which was the act of the legislature that eliminated the tax credit, originally had it ending at the end of the year. So September 30th was a little bit earlier than anticipated. However, there is a sort of counterintuitive benefit for the automotive industry at this point because there is what analysts call a pull through, people who are trying to take advantage of the credit before its expiration. So EV sales have increased over the last month or so as drivers try and take advantage of the tax credit.
What are dealers seeing? How much do we see as people trying to beat the deadline?
So in July, new EV sales were a bit above 130,000 units, which is roughly a 26% month over month increase and an almost 20% year over year increase. So the dealers are seeing that pull through.
And what brands are benefiting from that?
General Motors is one of the brands that is benefiting from that. The automaker reported record EV sales for the month of July, but basically every automaker that's eligible for the tax credit is expected to see some benefit from that anticipatory EV purchasing.
All right. And so, I mean, because part of the reason for that is that General Motors has basically from soup to nuts when it comes to EVs, everything from the Equinox all the way up to the Celestiq. Do you know if it's Celestiq or Celestiq? This is my
I
question.
don't know.
No one seems to. All right. So what are the experts saying about the long-term impact of losing the credits and the administration's uh, doing things that are taking out advantages that EV makers might have had?
The impacts, I think, will be a bit of a mixed bag. Obviously, the incentive has played an important role in encouraging EV purchases for some share of the population. And that's evidenced again by the fact that people are rushing to purchase EVs before the expiration of the tax credit on September 30th. But in talking to people who watch the industry closely, there are some interesting kind of side effects of the end of the tax credit that actually could be positive for the auto industry. So one of these is a sort of raw, unfiltered view of actual organic demand. Up until this point, the EV landscape has been kind of muddied by Tesla's success in 2019 and 2020, supply chain snarls during the pandemic, and then the installation of some of the federal incentives and some of the targets and requirements by states that have zero emission vehicles requirements. Now we will have a better sense of how consumers actually, to what extent consumers are actually interested in purchasing EVs for EV's sake. The other thing that someone said to me that I thought was really interesting is the presence of the tax credit has sort of fueled some of the existing sort of politicization of EVs. So people see the government as pushing a particular powertrain on the population, and, it's been framed as an issue of consumer choice. The take was that perhaps with the elimination of the tax credit, voters to the right will feel freer to, you know, in an unencumbered way, express interest and investigate EVs without this kind of stigma. However, another really important consideration is that the US is just one slice of the global market. A lot of the other regions are moving much more quickly toward electric vehicle adoption. The concern that I hear over and over again is that if domestic automakers and even European automakers retrench into internal combustion engine vehicles, that will put them at a significant disadvantage, especially from some of the Asian automakers and especially from some of the Chinese EV manufacturers, who, it must be said, with significant government assistance, have been able to offer cheap, technologically advanced electric vehicles that pose a threat to domestic market share.
And I think that whole thing about losing ground, the domestic automakers losing ground in this whole equation is a really important one because so much of the economy is based you know, automakers and the automotive industry. And you may not, like in Connecticut, we don't have an automotive plant here, but I'm sure that there are lots of places in the state that make elements for the, automakers or their, dealers. And dealers have a huge, economic impact too. Um, what, what do you think uh, how does this impact, like specifically the EV only automakers, Rivian and Lucid and Tesla, slate for future thought. Any thoughts on that?
The Tesla is such a interesting automaker and sort of almost plays by a different set of rules than the rest of the industry. I think that for Rivian, it really depends on whether the company is able to kind of deliver on its promises for the next generation of its vehicles, which are supposed to be more affordable. Rivian also has the advantage of a really advanced, the closest thing that the industry has, I would argue, to a true software-defined vehicle platform. It also has, a joint partnership with Volkswagen as far as an SDV partnership goes. And for the traditional automakers, I do think that it'll be interesting to see. They still have a financial stake in selling electric vehicles. The automakers know just as well as I know what I described earlier about what is happening in the global market. And a lot of these automakers have made investment in facilities and in battery technology and in charging infrastructure. I think that the rate of electric vehicle adoption will continue to grow. The million dollar question is at what pace?
I mean, and it's still growing. It's been growing all along. It just hasn't been growing the way we thought it would, move along, right?
Right. And actually, so I've been looking into this because we're working on a story ahead of the end of the tax credit that kind of takes a look back at how we got here. And there are so many interesting reasons why the EV sales growth rate projections were sort of optimistic. And one of those is Tesla. The traditional automakers looked at Tesla's success, saw that as an indicator of EV interest in general, and not an indication of this early adopter pool, which we've since come to learn about, or sort of minimizing the influence of Tesla's kind of brand power and aura. And so, yes, you're right. Electric vehicle adoption has been growing, and it's just the rate of adoption that is the question mark.
And when a lot of states, I counted briefly like 20 states still have some sort of program. Do you see some states as bringing their own program or increasing what they're putting out there?
Are you talking about for incentives?
Yes. Yep.
The EV incentives are a really interesting issue at the state level because even otherwise kind of true blue liberal states with Democratic majority legislatures and governors have re-examined their EV tax credits. The example that I give is the state of New Jersey. So it's just really interesting how a policy that was really proceeding full throttle at the federal level and at the state level has since developed this sort of political radioactivity that prompts even, as I said, liberal states to sort of reconsider those benefits. However, in the wake of the end of the electric vehicle tax credit, the state of California is considering sort of backfilling the credit to encourage that state's rate of
Mhm.
adoption. I think that the political winds in this country shift all the time. California is often a leader and sort of points the direction that other states with sort of friendly EV policies may go. So I wouldn't rule out, first of all, the preservation of existing electric vehicle tax credits or existing electric vehicle incentives at the state level and the addition of new credits or other incentives for states that want to encourage EV adoption.
And you've interviewed candidates for the open Senate seat in Michigan. You've talked to three of them, two of them at least.
Three of them, yeah.
Okay, which I found fascinating. Um,
Thanks.
do you think how much impact does does that one Senate seat have? Do you think? Because they all seem to be really in tune, obviously, with the automotive industry. Really have good connections with it. I was fascinated. The woman that you talked to, and I forget her name. She was a
McMorrow?
designer intern.
Yes, yes, Senator
Uh,
McMorrow.
yeah. So how how do you see if whoever comes to office? How do you see Michigan has influenced the bigger national debate?
I think Michigan is really a sort of signal of the direction that the Democratic Party may be going in terms of some of these sort of controversial issues. I'm thinking in particular about tariffs, about EV policy. You listened to the interviews and you heard that they're walking a really fine line between some protectionist policies that are meant to protect American workers and manufacturing, which is very important to the state of Michigan, preserving the domestic auto industry's competition on a global stage, which relates to the electric vehicle transition, and also navigating this dynamic about carrots and sticks from the federal government
Mhm.
and encouraging the sort of capitalist free market principles that the auto industry has valued and has benefited from in the past. It's also really interesting in a lot of those conversations, the 2008, 2009 auto crisis has come up because one of the many factors that contributed to that crisis was the industry's over reliance on emissions intensive vehicles, larger vehicles, pickups, SUVs, and then gas prices increased and that put the automakers in a difficult position. So it's interesting to me that that has come up as a kind of historical model, perhaps, for some of the fears that are permeating that race because of where the industry may go as a result of some of the elimination of the federal incentives for electric vehicles.
I think it's interesting, and one of the candidates brought this up, is this differentiation between looking at this as a short-term problem solution and a longer, 5, 10 years out. And the automotive industry in the past year has been caught in this state of flux where, they just have kind of gotten over the supply chain problem, and now where they get the cars and where they get the parts and all this other stuff is now just thrown to the wind. And so I mean, they have a lot of headwind going on their part. I just, it's interesting to watch. What's been the response to Ford's recent announcement at Louisville with, not only a new vehicle, but a less expensive vehicle, a modular vehicle, and a modular assembly line? What are other people saying about that? Because for me, honestly, I watched that announcement and I went, like, I felt like it was in a time machine, and I went back 3 years to watch this, and like, it just seemed really. I mean, it's great. I thought it was really interesting how they framed it, but what are other people saying about
That's also that's the same sort of tone of conversation that I've been privy to. People saying, looking at the global trade picture, looking at the global automotive market and this increasing push toward electric vehicles, toward software defined vehicles that have this zonal architecture, much more flexible platform that can enable different vehicle functions. It's, I also think that Ford just has this impenetrable brand power that even though this is a an announcement, as you say, with a very forward-looking orientation, people still associate the brand with sort of down-home American, traditional kind of auto industry goodness. And so I think it's really interesting that they made this decision. And my assessment is that if they feel that they had enough kind of brand credibility to make this type of decision that would otherwise be considered a sort of new agey kind of, yeah, globally oriented strategy.
patchouli? Yeah, patchouli scented cars. Yeah. Can we move over to software? And this is one of the focuses that you have in your reporting. What are the biggest challenges do you see car makers having when it comes to software development? And I say this because, like, cars are so, you know, the software is so baked in. I'm old enough to remember, like, the biggest technological part of the car was the AM/FM radio. So just seeing it so, wildly different these days is crazy.
Yes, the area of software and software enabled features and infotainment and navigation has become so important. And it's a really interesting challenge for the auto industry because, as you say, this was not an area of focus for consumers at all pre, I would argue like 2010, really. I mean, most people were
Yeah.
really just not aware of the potential capabilities. I remember in our family car, we had a Garmin navigation system, which was external, aftermarket navigation. It's funny to think about now, and also some
Yeah.
other similar kind of clunky solutions, auxiliary cables that plugged into a special box that you could insert into the cassette player. I mean, this was recent history. So what happened basically was that consumers began to expect a different level of sophistication from their vehicles, in part because of consumer electronics. You had, advanced touchscreens, constant over-the-air updates, accessibility via streaming, all of these different tools that you could access through your cell phone, and you're still working with buttons and knobs and a very unresponsive touchscreen in some cases in your vehicle. And so, again, you just can't overstate the impact of Tesla on a lot of this stuff. This was an automaker with vertical integration, with a much more sort of consumer tech minded attitude toward developing the software stack and enabling some of these features. And so automakers, in conjunction with that and before that, saw where the puck was going and decided to develop this. The reason why it's still such a challenge is because the auto industry, especially in the US, has really streamlined itself as an industry of manufacturing. There are all of these really long-standing, well-established relationships, supply chains, materials from companies that the automakers have very close relationships with. And now the automakers are trying to sort of differentiate themselves, in particular through the infotainment system. And that requires just an entirely new way of looking at hardware and software and all of these relationships. And they're not big tech companies. And it's hard for the automakers to attract the talent of big tech companies out in Silicon Valley. So it's a really important area for the industry. I will also just say, think about how often you interact with your central infotainment display. That
Hmm.
is really, at this point, the main consumer touch point for the vehicle. And until recently, automakers have basically, without a fight, ceded that ground to smartphone mirroring services like CarPlay and Android Auto.
Yeah.
And now the automakers are looking at that space and saying, wait a minute, there's all of this, first of all, consumer data and like sort of behavior data that we can mine from those interactions. This is an opportunity to try and sell people stuff through the central infotainment display. It's also just a sort of better, more integrated consumer experience if we are able to like sort of run that system natively. It's really dynamic and really interesting and remains a pretty significant pain point for the auto industry in general.
I really appreciate you taking the time. Where can people see your work, hear your work?
So I am a proud staffer at Automotive News. You can find my work at autonews.com. And I always love to hear from readers. People can reach me at Molly, MOLLY dot Boygon, B as in Bravo, OI as in India, GON as in November, at crane.com.
All right. I really appreciate you hanging out with me for the day, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Doug.
One. Before we go this week, I wanted to share with you a story from our sister station, KUSA 9 News in Denver, Colorado. It's a story about a museum that has a whole lot of movie and TV related cars and automobile paraphernalia, signs, and whatnot. Recently, they were forced to move, and they're hoping to raise enough funds so they can establish a new facility. Let's take a look.
I acquired everything in here, so everything has a story. Everything I got from somewhere, and now it's going to other people. My name is Zach Lawford. Oh, and I'm the owner and curator of the Rods and Bods Movie Car Museum. Well, we have to be out of here by the 1st. This current location is going to be demolished for apartments and a hotel, so we decided to sell some of the vehicles and some of the memorabilia pieces from the collection just so we can fund a building. I am sick of moving this museum, essentially, so we don't want to lease anymore. We want to buy something that we own, and this will help us fund that.
Double-sided Denver Motor Hotel lighted sign. Here it is, 500, 5.5, 350, sold $600.
So I started this company in 2017 with 12 cars. And then every year it just doubles and doubles and doubles, and then you get a museum. I'm pretty much a hoarder that turned it into a business. Here's how you solve it. Buy the Fall Guy truck. We'll throw all the stuff in the bed.
And then just drive out?
We're only selling about 60 cars of 180, and then some porcelain signs and memorabilia.
1044, here's going to be an 18-foot double-sided 10 Denver Diner neon sign. What an opportunity to buy a great piece of history.
It was only supposed to take me 2 weeks to decide what was in the auction. It took me 2 months, just because I didn't want to let any of it go.
Here we go, right there.
But it's cool because I'm watching all these families and these fathers, sons, mothers, daughters.
8,085.
Whole family getting excited, jumping up and down when they win something.
Do you really want it to go back to Indianapolis? Is that where you want it to end up, or do you want to keep it local? $9,000. $9,000.
Sad, happy, glad, it's everything.
Sold right here, $9,000. Congratulations.
That's it for this week's Car Pinionated. Glenn and I will be back next week, and we'll talk about the 60th anniversary of the Ford Bronco. And in the meantime, you can catch up on older Car Pinionated episodes by going to our YouTube playlist and look it up under Car Pinionated. And while you're there, give us a like and subscribe. And with that, we'll see you next time.